It's a great pleasure to introduce Emily Kneebone from the University of Nottingham. Many of you will know Emily's amazing work on opium, particularly her book, Opium's Haleutica, Charting a Didactic Epic. She's worked on the sea, the creatures of the sea, and on many other aspects of imperial verse, and particularly now looking at imperial epic, ecological approaches, I guess that's the right way of putting it, to imperial epic, and that's what we're going to see today, deforestation in imperial Greek epic. Thanks very much, Emily.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to talk. I've really enjoyed these papers and seeing how everything sort of ties together, actually, and I hope that what I want to say today will kind of fit in quite nicely with several of the issues and themes that have been raised already today. So this is very much, again, a work in progress. I'd be very grateful for any feedback or ideas or suggestions that people have. So as Jason mentioned, I'm currently writing a book on ecology and the environment and sort of different ideas of place and space and things in Imperial Greek epic poetry, so about sort of 1st to 6th century CE. And I talk today about only one of these poems and one brief moment from a poem. And that's the kind of immense ecological disruption that's caused by the Titan typhoon at the start of Nonnus's Dionysiaca. So the Titan tries to usurp Zeus's place and enshrine himself on Olympus, and we witness in this poem, for more or less the first pretty much 2 books of this epic, the impact of Typhon's fury and his attempt on the landscapes that he devastates, and we'll look today at some of the trees that he uproots as part of that devastation. And I think it's a scene that's remarkable not just for the scale of this ecological devastation, and I'll come back to scale in a moment, but the way in which the poet uses this idea of deforestation to interrogate really what trees stand for in the ancient world. So why the environment matters, how it relates to questions of politics, gender, mythology and religion, even the structure of the cosmos itself as Nonnus sees it. So these are, I'm aware, of pretty big claims, but it is a big epic. And it starts really with a bang with Typhon. So the Dionysiaca is 48 books, an epic, Greek epic poem about the god Dionysus, so his genealogy and his exploits and eventually his apotheosis, dates from the 5th century CE. And I say his genealogy because the god as we know him isn't even conceived until book 8. Which is quite a preamble, really. And we start instead with the abduction of Europa, because we're dealing with Dionysus's ancestry, so with Cadmus and his search for Europa. But this is immediately followed by this all-out conflict between Zeus and Typhon. And it's really easy to be thrown by this as a starting point, because there's no forewarning, really. There's some really strange details that don't seem to appear in other ancient sources, and they're simply introduced in an offhand way, and they turn out to be pivotal to the scene. This is very typical of Nonnus. He loves to sort of throw you. The complexities of this epic are kind of remarkable and take some getting used to. There's a very tenuous link to Cadmus in this whole episode. He turns out in this episode to be the saviour of Zeus, and that he helps Zeus get his power back. And there's really no narrative justification for the tale. We simply hear that Cadmus's wanderings take him directly into the path of the Typhonomachy, and then we sort of stay there for about 2 books as the world falls apart. But I think that there is method to this madness, and that this will turn out to be really kind of have a strong programmatic importance, as you might imagine, an epic that starts with the world almost ending. And it's important too, in structural terms, there's sort of symmetry with the role of Dionysus himself, so there's another gigantomachy there, and in some ways you can see this Typhon figure as a sort of distorted Dionysus, a would-be god who's trying to scale Olympus, but one who fails. And I'll start by singling out a few key features of this scene and how I think they kind of give us some insight into Nonnus's ecological thinking. So as I say, in book 1, we're introduced to the Typhonomachy with the offhand remark that during his search for Europa, Cadmus happens to arrive in Cilicia at a pivotal moment. So he came to the bloody cave of Arima at the time when the mobile mountains were pounding on the gates of impregnable Olympus, being kind of piled up to reach Olympus, when the winged gods high above the suing Nile were imitating the swift flight of birds, traversing an unfamiliar path amidst the currents of airs, and the celestial sphere with its 7 zones began to take a beating. So at this point, Typhon has pinched the weapons and the sinews of Zeus, i.e. his strength, and he's throwing everything that he can at the world in order to kind of make his mark on it. And there are three elements here that I think are typical of Nonnus's depiction of this scene and are kind of worth thinking about further. And the first is the malleability of this world. The ways in which kind of environments in this poem are constantly being shaped by the actions that we see play out. And this is absolutely crucial to Nonnus's worldview, that we're dealing here with a time when Dionysus isn't even conceived yet as the kind of primordial world. And it's a world that's being shaped, it's kind of a deep geological era in which we kind of witness the landscapes being formed, and things like, landscapes that we know today are shaped by the actions in the poem and by the kind of mythological details that take place. And here, you've got the sort of mobility, the mountains, nothing seems to be fixed in this poem, and that is crucial. It's a poem that is all about change and flux and instability, and that goes for landscapes, it goes for climates, it goes for, even things you think you see the Dionysiac world as one of shifting and changing constantly, and that's marked out in environmental terms throughout the poem, but particularly here, where we watch the earth being kind of torn apart and gouged out and reformed by the actions that take place. So that's my first point. My second is about the displacement of all kinds of beings from their habitual place of residence as a result of environmental change. So Typhon is has mustered this assault on the world, and everything is pushed out of its proper position. There are all kinds of markers of cosmic disarray, and that goes, as we'll see, and this is kind of the point of the passage that I've got on the handout, the main focus of the episode for us today. So it goes for animals, it goes for human beings, and it goes even for gods. So even the gods are being displaced by this sort of assault on Olympus. So constellations too, and marine animals, everything really is pushed out of its proper place. And I think the third thing we can draw from this is the scale and scope of this conflict, and this is truly a global catastrophe, and I think that's really important, is Nonnus's global purview here. So Typhon for Nonnus is both a giant and a titan, so the two are routinely conflated by this period. He's stolen Zeus's weapons and he's attacking the sky. He's attacking not just the sort of space of the sky, but the constellations, the celestial bodies, the ordering markers of time. And in this poem as a whole, Nonnus is obsessed by these sort of markers of temporality, by the kind of recurring figures of hours and seasons, day and night, all that sort of thing. All of this is being shaken by this assault. But he also shakes up kind of mountains and rivers. He's so big he kind of causes the sea to surge up. And each of these concerns then is kind of played out throughout the episode and the epic. So the main focus I want to look at is this passage on the handout. I put it here in its entirety, almost its entirety, I've excerpted some of it, in case anyone wants to kind of look at it further and see the context for what happens, but I'll put some key passages on the PowerPoint. So we've moved on from this moment here, that's Cadmus arriving to this initial assault. Cadmus has essentially tricked Typhon and regained Zeus's weapons and his sinews, kind of that give him strength. So this will be the eve of battle. So it's the day before this kind of almighty cosmic conflict between Zeus and Typhon. Typhon realizes that he's been tricked. And he is furious, he's absolutely livid. So he pounds the landscape again, again we have these sort of cataclysms, we have floods, we have kind of, the shaking and devastation of that landscape. He eats the creatures, and there's a lot of his different sort of heads. He's got all these animal heads, eating their counterpart animals, and him reveling in the sort of symbolism and symmetry of all these different species he's devouring. He drinks up the rivers. So you can see there we have the idea of the kind of water nymphs who are astonished by what's happening and can't work out, the rivers that they're used to inhabiting and now dried up. And then nymphs and human beings are also displaced from their habitats and activities. Typhoon kind of tears apart the earth, throws rocks, the underground rivers are exposed. And then here are trees on the start of the second page of the handout. So trees are uprooted, torn up from the earth, plants are destroyed, and all the gods mourn in turn for their favourite plants. Nymphs and hamadryds are also exposed when their trees are damaged. This comes back to one of the conversations we were having earlier about this idea of trees being sort of inhabited and the morality of this. So we have two speeches from a pine nymph and a laurel nymph. They have kind of exchanged these fears that they will then become victims of sexual violence, that no corner of the world is safe for them anymore, and no kind of metamorphosis either. So that's the kind of orientation of what's going on in this passage. And I think it really is kind of remarkable in all sorts of ways. So one thing that I think is quite important here is, again, this point about scale. We can see this almost as a sort of, when we talked about climate change, global warming, all that kind of thing, we have all, markers of cataclysm throughout this whole narrative. We have really startling changes in climate. So as part of the fight between Zeus and Typhon, we have moments where the earth is sort of blasted by heat, and then we get ice, and we get this sort of alternate sort of fluctuation of climates. We have kind of flooding, we have drying up of waterbeds, we have kind of displacement of species from their normal habitats and things like that. And what I mean by this is it's really a narrative about a truly global issue. And Typhon's aims are kind of, explicitly imperial in scope. He talks about kind of forming a new leadership on Olympus. He's going to be the sort of the ruler of the skies. And he talks in terms of enslavement, so enslavement of particular species, but enslavement particularly of the other gods, the Olympian gods, Apollo and others, and of sexual violence towards the kind of previous inhabitants, as well as territorial expansion and the sort of impact that he has on the earth. And I think that's important, this idea that we have a sense under changes of political leadership and this sort of new demonstrations of power, and this came up earlier actually in Kesho's talk as well, the kind of idea of the Titan and the giant kind of and the hubris there being kind of an emblem of imperial control of the landscape too in similar ways. That this is a kind of a sense that we have a vulnerability that these powerful agents have, that they create in those who are displaced by their imperial ambitions, when they really don't care who is displaced or harmed by their actions, by their shows of power. And it's framed in this epic not just as his own kind of personal conquest. So he talks in territorial terms about it, kind of almost an imperial conquest, not just of new lands, but of the sky itself, he says. But it's also kind of an expansion and a change and alteration of the very structures of the cosmos. So we saw that we have kind of the celestial sphere with its 7 zones. Not anymore. Typhon wants to make an 8th. He says, the 7, they're not enough to contain me. I'm going to create another sphere, another kind of zone of the sky. And this is very much kind of epic that's scaled up. This action that kind of, we see kind of collapse of coastlines, floods, we have this kind of climate change. It's an action that threatens to engulf and destroy the whole world. It's said explicitly, so the roar of battle, it sounded all around. Eris accompanied Typhon, Nike led Zeus. Not a dispute about a herd of cows or a flock of sheep. It's not a quarrel about a beautiful young bride. No fight for a paltry town. This is a battle over the sky itself. On the knees of victory lay the sceptre and the throne of Zeus, the prizes for the combat. So Nomos here was sort of going all out, and partly here, of course, you can see a kind of a combative engagement with Homer here. All the way through the epic, you get that sense that he's trying to outdo even the Homeric epics in terms of scale and scope. The epic's 48 books long. It's very deliberately double, the Iliad and the Odyssey combined, and there are elements of both of those together. He talks about kind of his competition in very explicit terms with Father Homer as well. So there is a kind of Homeric element to that. But there are other things, I think, going on as well. And I do think this question of kind of global politics, you know, I'll talk at the end very briefly about ways in which we might see this speaking to contemporary debates. And one of those is about the kind of political or imperial or kind of global questions and the risks of this sort of narrative of globalization. So Nonus is kind of exploding the idea of scale. He's starting very deliberately with the kind of near destruction of the entire cosmos as a whole. And what I think is quite interesting is that we do come back as part of this, as we've seen, to the kind of question of nymphs. So nymphi do get to speak in this epic, and he sort of returns us to their point of view. So we have a kind of a tension between the global, and particularly the global as a kind of an emblem of the giant's kind of hubristic ambition, and the importance of a kind of a local, rooted, individuated perspective as well, that it's important to belong somewhere, to be part of something, to have that kind of strong sense of identity. And, you know, there are other things too. This shift between the enormous and the kind of small scale is a marker in ancient literary critical terms of sublimity. So Longinus talks about that too, that, you know, you can't be sublime if you're only talking about big things. It's that shift in perspective that generates sublimity as well. But I think this question of the tension between the local and the global is quite important for Nonus. And it's telling too that actually the way in which Cadmus wins over Typho and manages to trick him is by a very sort of small scale mode, which is to dress up as a shepherd and play a pastoral song. And Typho says, "What are you doing? This is ridiculous. You've only got panpipes. I've got these enormous weapons of Zeus." But he's so beguiled by this music that he then says, "Let me give you other things. Just play again. I'll give you these sinews so you can make them into a lyre." And of course, there's Zeus's sinews. And then as he beguiles the giant, then Zeus is able to kind of reclaim his things. So actually, there's a kind of a re-engagement with the importance of this sort of small-scale, local, pastoral tradition, the idea that the landscape is important, that there is a kind of, I mean, he's there in the wood as he plays this music. And I think putting those two together, that kind of oscillation between the two, is very kind of something that Nonus and also Colutus and other poets of this era are very, very interested in. There's almost a kind of generic quality to this sort of combat, this engagement between epic with its sort of magnitude and pastoral with its self-consciously sort of more local engagement with that landscape. And so it's that intense personal local investment in the landscape that will ensure the survival of that very landscape by foiling Typhon. So there's a kind of victory for that local at one level. So we have then a sense that these trees are being uprooted and everyone is grieving for them. There's no sense that this is a good thing. It is profound ecological devastation and everyone is horrified. And that goes for, you know, those who are displaced, so those who have a sort of sudden sort of shock as to what's happened to their environment, but it also goes for the gods. So all of the gods are mourning for their favoured trees. So Phoebus singing a song for his hyacinth, for the laurel, Pan for his pine. We have Athena, we have Aphrodite, we have Demeter, everybody mourning for their particular kind of favoured form of tree or vegetation. And there is this, you know, it comes back to this question of the sort of the ways in which kind of the environment are marked out as kind of having a religious significance in the ancient world. But I think what's so fascinating about this tale is that, you know, we have this vision of Pan and Apollo mourning for their trees, but then immediately afterwards we completely switch perspectives. And so we have these nymphs and hamadryads. So they mourn because, you know, their trees have been felled or cloven and they're no longer safe. So let's flee. Let's both run away together, says the pine nymph to the laurel, in case you see Phoebus or I see Pan. For us to pass by, these trees don't cut the tree of wretched Daphne, it's already been cut. Have a care, carpenter, don't cut planks of pine to make a ship. I wouldn't want them to touch the waves of marine Aphrodite. Woodcutter, grant me one last favour. Don't strike my clustering branches with your axe, but strike me. Lodge in my breast the chaste bronze of Athena, she who keeps clear of marriage. I really want to remain a virgin, just kill me so I can. In this way, I may die before I am married and go to the underworld a virgin, still ignorant of love, just like Pitys and just like Daphne. With these words, she, like the pine nymph, made a makeshift girdle out of leaves, and with this green belt covered her full breast to hide her shame, clamping her thighs together. I think this is really extraordinary. It's really, really interesting because it suddenly reverses our perspective. We've had this image of the gods mourning for these trees, and now we see the kind of the nymphs of these trees in utter terror of these gods. And there are kind of ways in which, this is, so we had Pan before, Helen Pityn, his Pan. But, in what ways is she his? Is that a sort of a sense of a kind of romantic relationship, or is that quite an aggressive marker of domination as well? What is the nature of that connection between the pine and Pan in a very, very kind of represented as erotically violent pastoral world here? And there is, I think, a kind of duplicity almost on the part of Apollo and Pan, or perhaps the Apollos and Pans of this world, grieving for those very figures that they are then themselves endangering or threatening with violence, or sort of enslaving or subjugating to their own will. And again, there are all sorts of kind of modern parallels we might think about if we think about it in those terms. So I think as well as the kind of imperial political narrative, there's another kind of political element to this ecological destruction, and that's the kind of effects of Typhoon's actions on the already kind of marginalised or disempowered populations, and that kind of intersection between the ways in which different structures of power mesh together. So power relations of gods, of Typhon as this sort of kind of mighty figure, and ecological damage, and the way in which ecological damage is used by the kind of political and imperial causes, but also as part of this kind of structures of gendered violence. And I think it's absolutely fascinating, this idea that the pine nymphs and the lower nymphs are not terrified that they're going to die in a sort of a flood or a global catastrophe. They're terrified of sexual violence. That the falling apart of the tree, or the removal of the tree, is a removal of protection, a sense that we've got a newfound vulnerability to the kind of the world that they live in. And there is a kind of an interesting tension here, or a dynamic, I think, between the actions of Typhon, who's kind of felled these trees, and the human actors, the forester, the carpenter, the kind of woodcutters. We get a threefold invocation. Whenever what we see in this passage is not anthropogenic destruction, this is a kind of a giant or a titan figure who is destroying the environment. But there are kind of hints all the way through the passage that actually this is a kind of a scaled up version of what human beings do all the time. So we have there that idea that this is a kind of an echo of the woodcutter's activity. And you can see there the kind of the invocation there with the planks of pine to make a ship. You see the kind of technology that we heard about from Emma and others earlier as well, the idea that this is kind of invested in a kind of a whole system of the exploitation of these natural resources in order to further particular ends. And we see it too with agriculture, to come back to something that Lola was talking about earlier as well, the kind of the violence inherent in the agricultural enterprise. So we have, so that the ploughman, as part of this passage, stops sowing the seeds in the earth and kind of ploughing it, cutting up the earth with the furrow. But he'd already, the earth had already been cut by the movement of Typhon's hand. And so the hollows of the earth are kind of laid bare, and everything from within kind of bursts forth. It's almost a kind of a cosmic, slightly frightening and distorted version of agriculture writ large in all sorts of ways. And not just agriculture, the kind of the hollowing out of the earth and seeing what's within. It's a much more, it's not one that ends in fruitful, generative kind of productivity. It's a very negative version of it. But it ties in with this kind of fascination of what might be beneath the earth, ready to spring forth. And again, we come back to that a little bit later with Cadmus and the sort of the giants kind of springing out of the earth itself. So we have Typhon's damage then being linked to routine human activity, to agriculture, wood felling, and shipbuilding and things as well. We even have this sort of sense that trees are being used to make weapons too. Again, a kind of a distorted, sort of gigantic version of what we see in the level of human activity. So here, trees are not used to cut down to make wood. They are used as entire sort of javelins and weapons. So Tycho then trees with his hands brandish them, along with other fine-leaved plants pulled from the earth. These Zeus reluctantly at acorn obliterated with a single spark of the thunderbolt hurled from his mighty hand. Many an elm was thrown, along with pine trees of the same age, etc. But I do think we can read this idea of wood being used for weapons, particularly with this idea that you have the elm being thrown along with a pine tree, homilerchy, so of the same age. That's exactly the language that we've been using of the hamadryads and nymphs, and those who've grown up with the trees and those who are kind of the same age as one another. There's a way in which this vision early in the poem of these kind of nymphs and their engagement with these trees means that we can't quite read these trees in the same way. Again, we can't strip them of that sense that there is a kind of animated force, that there is, they are not simply inert material. So what we get from the laurel nymph in response is again a kind of a very interesting reflection on the nature of what it might mean to be suddenly made vulnerable to the forces around. So she says, air, mountain, sea, all are out of bounds, and the actual speech is much longer. I've just given you a bit here. I'll hide myself in the air. So what she's saying is, I can't go anywhere because there are all these predatory males, particularly the gods, that inhabit every single sphere. Wherever you look in the world, there are kind of narratives of erotic violence that the kind of whole landscape is saturated with. And it's a vision that we see again and again in this poem, and it's a very violent poem. There's a lot of sexual violence in it as a whole. Dionysus is not a nice god, and none of those that he consorts with. And there is this vision, and again, it's something that we see elsewhere in kind of later Greek epic as well, that the environment really is saturated with these tales of kind of horrible examples of sexual violence, and they're kind of inescapable, and that's what she's reflecting on here. There's nowhere where that you can't think of a myth where for instance a figure has been subject to sexual violence and kind of metamorphosed, or that wasn't the kind of backdrop to a tale of rape. So she says, where can I go? Should I couple with Tycho? And I wish I were another shrub, that my line could pass from tree to tree, each child preserving a chaste name. So this question of where kind of desire for virginity fits into a lot of this kind of idea of a future. May I not escape being Daphne, only to be known as the plant that carries the wicked name of Myrrh. And I think both of these speeches, the one from the pine tree and the one from the laurel, raise a lot of kind of questions about the kind of ontological status of these figures. What relationship do they have with the trees that kind of house them or contain them? And that's answered in different ways at kind of different points in this narrative. There's also the question of what relationship this Pittis, this pine tree, has with the original metamorphosed Pittis, the one who was metamorphosed, as part of a tale of erotic violence at the hands of Pan. And that too is something that they kind of reflect on. And I think there's a kind of an interest here in the part of Nonnus. So we're dealing with kind of the 5th century. We know Nonnus writes Christian epic as well. It's an interest in kind of interrogating these pagan notions, I think, of what it might look like to have a kind of a world where you have, trees that are in some sense alive, or, they have these sort of spirits, or that there's something kind of mysterious and sacred about a lot of the kind of the landscapes around. And I think you can see here, so the idea that if we go back to the last bit here, the pine nymph is imagined as naked without her tree. And that's interesting, that there is a sense that we are not just imagining these sort of nubile figures within the tree, but actually that the tree forms their clothing, that they are kind of part of it, almost that the tree is seen as a body. So she is naked without the tree, so she makes a makeshift girdle out of leaves, and to hide her shame. That this is part of that vulnerability, is that when you strip off the tree, it's almost as if she is inside vulnerable and naked. And that's something we find later as well in the depiction of the earth. And my kind of final point about this representation really is the idea that even the earth isn't safe. So the Laurel nymph says, thanks to the giant snaky feet, venomous water snakes slither down into holes beneath the ground. So the earth is not a safe space for these figures either, because the earth, Gaia, is Typhoon's mother. And we have a kind of a repeated insistence that actually Gaia is on Typhoon's side here. So here we see Earth tearing her tunic of rocks. She has the wind buffet, this is when Typhoon is being conquered, has the wind buffet the trees and snip her hair, scything off the curls from her treetop head, just as in the month when the leaves fall. And she sort of gouges out the gullies of her cheeks. Through her moist hollows there flowed noisy rivers of tears as Earth wept. So I think there are 2 points here. One is this idea that the earth too, that trees are like the hair or the headdress of the earth, something we saw a little bit with the nymphs, but that really recurs in this depiction of Gaia. And that you can do that quite easily in Greek because chaiter and other words as well. So hair can also be used of the foliage of trees as well, that is kind of embedded in the language in the way, so we talked about kind of analogy as being sort of central to kind of ancient modes of thought earlier. And I think that's another good example that this kind of, you then end up creating this sort of world that is in some ways it is actually anthropomorphic in that way. But there is also, I think, quite a deep ambivalence here in this representation of Gaia. So we've got the idea of the earth as sort of snaky and associated with these sort of monsters, with Typhon and others. That the earth, is actually facilitating, in fact, initiates Typhon's insurrection in the first place. And so it's not as simple as kind of ecological being kind of equating to preservation of Gaia. Gaia is very much on Typhon's side here. And actually it's only at the end of the narrative when Physis, nature, has to intervene. So it's not Earth at all that kind of restores the order of things. It's Physis, or nature. So just to kind of wrap up what I've been saying here, I think it's an absolutely fascinating passage that probably raises more questions than it answers. But I think Monas is like that, and I think it's worth asking these questions anyway. But I think I've tried to show 3 ways in which I think this passage speaks to contemporary debates. One is the idea of a kind of global ecology. So Nonas's emphasis on this kind of truly global scope. The idea of global catastrophe and kind of climate change and new surprising kind of developments, deforestation being part of that, floods, drying up of riverbeds, sudden switches in meteorological conditions, all of that kind of thing. And that this causes displacement. So this is a narrative all the way through these books really about displacement of populations. It starts off with Europa and with kind of moving and being sort of displaced from one's habitat. And I think trees give us a particular perspective on that idea of being rooted, being embedded, kind of having a perspective, a local perspective. I've noticed that this is kind of a deep geological time of formation of the kind of the moulding, the malleability of the earth. And that this is, not only in the kind of deep mists of time, but really this is kind of big on scale. And Edith and others have kind of shown really nicely this kind of obsession in epic with the idea of limitlessness and sort of the magisterial scope of things is kind of deeply built into epic itself. But Monas takes the Homeric scale and just kind of blows it apart. But this is also about kind of the political or imperial qualities of that global project. So at one level, this is an epic that celebrates territorial conquest. So Dionysus simply subjugates an entire people, the Indians. He just fights a very, very lightly motivated war against them and conquers them. And it's a project that is partly about territorial conquest and subjugation. It's partly also about the introduction of a new monoculture. So he brings the vine to kind of human life. So Nonus partly celebrates that, but partly also shows us the darker side of that project. So gestures towards the kind of profound ecological impact of these sort of agricultural innovations as a form of violence towards the earth, in ways that reminds me of things that Timothy Morton and others have shown about the ways in which millennia of what he calls agri-logistics kind of lying at the heart of our current ecological crisis, so the modes of farming, actually have a kind of huge impact on where we are today. In quite negative ways. But it's also about the felling of trees to make ships and weapons, something that kind of is explored by other Greek poets of this era as well. So as kind of would-be imperialist aggressors who have a profound impact on the environment they seek to colonise, both Typhon and Dionysus have quite a lot in common in quite interesting ways. And I think as a counterpart to that global scope, Nonus really does reassert the importance of local identity. So the idea of the roots of trees being quite important, that they can signal stability and you know, the importance of place. And actually that's one of the things that the speeches from the pine and the laurel say, is that one tree is not the same as another as well, that there is that sort of sense that there is this kind of specificity. They have one single tree, you can't just change into another one at will. Secondly, the gender politics, so the intertwining of ecological and sexual violence, kind of relationship of both with kind of disempowerment and displacement. So partly this is about the kind of ecological devastation on already marginalised communities, so young women or indigenous populations, which is quite later in Nonus. But partly also, you can read that in eco-feminist terms, as a tendency to code the natural world as sort of inert or female, or ready to be ploughed or shaped or harvested or used for, you know, sort of man's advancement. And we've seen that a little bit, I think, too, in Nonus's juxtaposition of the gods' supposedly ecological grief at Typhon's deforestation with the same tree nymph's own terror at those gods. So there's kind of hypocrisy or a double think in our dealings with nature, and particularly here played out through ecological devastation being enmeshed with gendered violence. And finally, I think what we see here is kind of the living nature of this matter, the propensity that's you see all over the ancient world, but particularly in Nonus, to see trees and earth as bodies, but also more than just kind of inert matter, but as animated, hyper-animated almost in this epic. So trees kind of here speak back. They are a kind of storied matter, and they do that to reassert a kind of narrative that counters the dominant kind of political narrative, the hierarchical narrative imposed by gods or those in power. And I think there are also kind of undercurrents of a sort of darker ecology here, the raw violence and the horror at Gaia, for instance, which we could put in dialogue with Bruno Latour's interrogation of the kind of status and reception of James Lovelock's Gaia as an emblem for the Anthropocene, which was mentioned earlier as well. And I'm kind of really heartened by the fact that many of these points have come out in different forms in many of these papers today. And I hope to have shown that Dionysiaca, which is in many ways the most vegetative of epics, has a central place in these debates. Thank you.